Hi, this is Paul. About a week or so ago, I had this conversation with John Vervaeke and J.P. Marceau, and that conversation was in many ways I think in some ways exactly what John Vervaeke has been working towards in terms of dialogos. And even though we didn't stream it live, there is my commitment to not editing and my commitment to posting this stuff sort of puts me on a spot so we're talking about miracles because J.P. Marceau read C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, addressed then John's non-reductive physicalism. I think, and this is where community really comes into play because J.P. Marceau has a degree in philosophy. I do not, and really had been paying close attention to John Vervaeke's systems and working it through. Of course, J.P. was talking about panpsychism a while ago. And so we had all these conversations flying around. And then JP writes this piece on C.S. Lewis's Miracles and John's non-reductive physicalism. And I mean, JP's just working through all these different angles, and he'd already had a conversation with John. And so I said, well, maybe the three of us can have a conversation. JP said, yeah. And John said, yeah. So off we went. And it was a great conversation. If you haven't watched it, you should watch it. And then John hits me with this question, is a placebo, would you consider the placebo effect a miracle? And part of what happens in conversation is, I guess I could have, maybe it would be wise to say, well, let me think about that. But I don't like to do that, so I want to give him an answer. And part of me, instinctively, part of me felt like, I should say no, because miracles are from God and placebo effects are from doctors. But another part of me thought, especially because I'm sort of thinking through Lewis and his book Miracles, and we're talking about reason and causality and all of these things, and nobody had ever asked me that question before. And I'm on the spot. And out of my mouth comes, yes. And I think John was surprised, and JP was surprised, and I think I was probably at least as surprised. I've got to turn off notifications, otherwise I get disrupted, just like I was right there, interrupted. But I think I was just as surprised as both of them. And of course, I've got some messages and email like, well, what is a miracle? And the more I thought about it, and the more I lived into it in the midst of that conversation, the happier I was with the answer. Now, maybe upon further reflection, I'll decide it was a bad answer, and someone will convince me that I'm wrong, and I'm totally okay with that. But, I mean, John's question just brought me to new levels in this favorite book of mine, C.S. Lewis's Miracles, and thinking about what Lewis had taught me and how Lewis had shaped me in ways that I had been taught and shaped, but the little conscious member of my consciousness Congress wasn't terribly fully informed by. And suddenly it's, I've been to Christian Reform Synod, which is kind of our binational judiciary body, and often with synod you just kind of rumble through things and you know what's going to happen, and every few synods there'll be a moment, it'll be just like bang, something, the world has changed, this vote didn't go like anyone would have imagined, and so that question is a placebo a miracle? Now, this has been sort of rummaging around in my head for a while. And that's, thinking fast and slow. It's often the slow thinking. It's okay, what out of a conversation has been haunting me? And so there's a little group of my consciousness Congress that won't let something go, but the conscious member of it isn't informed, and it'll come up in your dreams, and it'll come up in those quieter moments, and is a placebo a miracle? Is a placebo a miracle? And so this moment and a few other moments in that conversation, that was a conversation that I will not soon forget. a few other moments in that conversation too just continue to haunt me, and so I go back to them and I chew on them, and of course I'm going to make videos about them because I'm chewing on them, and maybe we'll do it again. So I looked up a placebo, and first I looked at WebMD, but it's like, no, I'm not gonna go on there with WebMD. Harvard Health Publishing, well, trusted advice for a healthier life, right there with the Veritas Harvard, former Puritans who lost their way. How dare you? But here we are, and we all trust Harvard. I was listening to Mencius Moldbug and David, I forget his last name, begins with a G, Tim Lee from the Discord server had sent me that video, and later someone else posted it, and that's a whole nother video that's continued to inhabit me. But Harvard, so I believe it. And well, what is a placebo? Well, I didn't put the link in. I gotta go get it. Your mind can be a powerful healing tool when given the chance. The idea that your brain can convince your body a fake treatment is a real thing. Now, somebody there is just writing, but those words are laden. A fake treatment is a real thing. Well, what is the real? Well, the real is your body is a system of chemicals, and the addition of another chemical will change the chemical, and that will somehow heal you, whereas the what? Well, the thoughts. What are those thoughts? Well, the fake treatment is the real thing, the so-called placebo effect, and thus stimulate healing has been around for millennia. Now, science has found that under the right circumstances, now they're starting to sound like psychedelics here, the right circumstances, a placebo can be just as effective as traditional treatment. Now, if I went to someone and said, well, let's not go to the doctor with the plaque from Harvard on his wall. Let's get traditional medicine. Okay, now what tradition are we talking about here? We all know what tradition we're talking about here. The placebo effect is more than positive thinking. Believing a treatment or procedure will work. It's about creating a stronger connection between the brain and the body, as if the brain weren't a part of the body, and how they work together, says Professor Ted Kapchuk of Harvard, affiliated Beth Israel Deaconess. Got Christians and Jews all over the place here. Medical center whose research focused on the placebo effect. Placebos won't lower your cholesterol or shrink a tumor. Instead, placebos will work on symptoms modulated by the brain, like the perception of pain. Unlike real pain, someone's coming to me with a broken hand. No, you just have the perception of pain. Placebos may make you feel better, but they will not cure you. Well, I guess it depends on what exactly you're looking to be cured from, says Kapchuk. They have been shown to be most effective for conditions like pain management, stress-related insomnia, and cancer treatment side effects like fatigue and nausea. But someone comes to you and talks about, I'm having chemotherapy, so I have fatigue and nausea, and you say, it's all in your head. Oh, people are not going to be happy with you. What do you mean it's all in my head? They're putting this chemotherapy, they're putting this poison in my body that's retarding cellular growth systemically in my body, because cancer is an overrunning systemic growth, and so I get to die a little slower if the cancer dies a little faster. There's chemotherapy. And again, as a pastor, you get to be with a lot of people who have chemotherapy. Does the placebo effect mean failure or success? For years, a placebo effect was considered a sign of failure. A placebo is used in clinical trials for tests, the effectiveness of treatments, and most often of drug studies. Now, here's something that's sort of weird, because if the whole efficacy, and we're going to use that word a lot during this video, efficacy, if the efficacy of a drug is trying to be tested by giving someone this drug and they're all lying, but, well, not really lying because we're telling it might be. We're lying to the patient as if patients who are taking one drug, well, they can't tell, can they? So what does that do to your drug test? If you say on one hand, placebo can be just as effective as the regular drug in certain cases. So wouldn't the placebo effect impact all of your drug studies? Now, somebody out there, a doctor, is probably going to say, yeah, we've taken that into consideration, and maybe Tyler and his statistics are going to, and I'm open to all that, believe me, but think of the frame here. You start a drug study and say, we're going to give half of the people the vaccine for the COVID and the other half of the people a placebo. But what happens if the placebo has the placebo effect and they don't get the COVID? Well, no, it's only for like pain and stuff. But how are you going to know if they don't get the COVID because of this? Because already we don't know who gets the COVID and who doesn't. So more recently, however, because that's always means truer, more recently, however, experts have concluded that reacting to a placebo is not proof that a certain treatment doesn't work, but rather that another non-pharmacological mechanism, look at the language we're putting on this. It's a non-pharmacological, mechanism. It's nature. It's physics. I just had a conversation with two Michaels today. Michael DeFuchsia, who's written this book on Barfield, and Michael L. I'll probably post this video on Tuesday if I finish it, in fact. And then the conversation a little bit later in the week, because I like to go conversation, monologue, in case you haven't noticed, unless I have whole lots of conversations in me, I just got to get them out there. So a mechanism, that's what's inside of us, little gears and things, right? How placebos work is not quite understood. But involves, it's not understood, but involves, complex neurobiological reaction. That sounds a little fudgy to me. That includes everything from increases in feel-good neurotransmitters like endorphins and dopamine. Let's put some of these medical sciencey words in here, even if we don't even really quite know what they mean. But we just feel better because they're medical and sciencey, and people with white coats and fancy degrees say these to us, and that's what makes sense of the world. And I regularly have people say, well, I'm not crazy. I have a chemical imbalance, because chemical imbalance was the big words of the 70s and 80s that said, well, I'm not crazy. I have a chemical imbalance. But then somebody's angry with you and they're flying off the handle and they're throwing things around the room and say, oh, you're not crazy. You have a chemical imbalance. What? I've got a chemical imbalance? How dare you say I've got a chemical imbalance? I'm sane, but I'm mad at you for justifiable reasons. Anyway. How placebos work is not quite understood, but involves complex neurobiological reaction that includes everything from increases in feel-good neurotransmitters like endorphins and dopamine to greater activity in certain brain regions linked to moods, emotional reactions, and self-awareness. All of it can have a therapeutic benefit. The placebo effect is a way for your brain to tell the body what it needs to feel better. So if I'm not feeling good, and what about that experience makes me think that it's a good one? And so I'm going to go to a doctor, and the doctor says, you shouldn't feel so bad. I shouldn't feel so bad. And then I don't feel so bad. Is that a miracle? No, miracles are violations of the laws of nature. Oh. But what kind of laws are at work here? Placebos are not all about releasing brain power. Ooh, there's more. You also need the ritual of treatment. Where did we loan that word from? When you look at these studies that compare drugs with placebos, there is an entire environmental and ritual factor at work. Sounds we're creeping towards the churchy miraculous, if you ask me, says Kapchuk. You have to go to a clinic at certain times and be examined by medical professionals in white coats. You receive all kinds of exotic pills and undergo strange procedures. All of this can have a profound impact on how the body perceives. My body is perceiving. My body is perceiving. Oh, body, speak to me. Paul, you haven't eaten today, but you're doing pretty good. You're burning fat. Is that what my body would say? The body keeps the score. You receive all kinds of exotic pills and undergo strange procedures. All this can have a profound impact on how the body perceives symptoms because you feel you are getting attention and care. Giving yourself a placebo. Placebos often work because people don't know they're getting one. But what happens if you know you're getting a placebo, like you're in a drug trial and, somebody is, they've taken the pills. It's like, I don't feel anything. Another person's taking the pills like, oh gosh, I feel horrible. Well, there you go. You probably got the real thing. Or maybe you didn't. In a 2014 study led by Kapchuk and published in Science Translational Medicine, explores this by testing how people react to migraine pain medication. It's all in your head in a lot of different ways. One group took a migraine drug labeled with the drug's name. Another took a placebo labeled placebo. Hardly lying to them now. And a third took nothing. The researchers discovered that the placebo was 50% as effective as the real drug to reduce pain in a migraine attack. That placebo, give me some of that. The researchers speculated that driving force beyond this reaction was the simple act of taking a pill. People associate the ritual of taking medicine as a positive healing effect. Wonder where we learned that. But even if they know it's not medicine, the action itself can stimulate the brain into thinking. That makes it sound all science-y, right? To stimulate the brain into thinking. Sort of like watching YouTube or Netflix or the grass grow, perhaps. How can you give yourself a placebo besides taking a fake pill? Because, I don't have really in my house a pill-making machine, so I don't feel good today. I'm going to make myself a placebo. Practicing self-help medicine is one way. Engaging in the ritual of healthy living. Eating right. Exercising. So is eating right and exercising a placebo? Is that what the news has been doing to us for all this time? Yoga. Oh. Social quality time, meditating. I don't see any church going in this. Harvard, descendants of Puritans, Veritas, European-looking lion. Yoga, meditating, eating right and healthy. But don't go to your pastor. Say, Pastor, I'm sick. Lay hands on me. Call the elders. The prayer of a righteous man. If you know the book of James. These activities are positive interventions in their own right. The level of attention you give can enhance their benefits. Have the whole family come around. I'm drinking the sacred water from the tap. No, I'm drinking the sacred water from the bottle. The attention and emotional support you give yourself is often not something you can easily measure, but can help you feel more comfortable in the world as opposed to outside of the world. Where does this language come from? And you can go a long way when it comes to healing. Now we have a big picture of the brain. And there it is. Harvard tells me so. Let's see. Placebo effect is already at work even before I read it. WebMD isn't quite as placebo-ish as Harvard. Is this white science? What do you mean as opposed to black magic? No, as opposed to woke stuff. This is white scientism and traditional healings. Well, which traditional are we talking about? Can you feel modernity ebbing away? You can just feel it, can't you? I can just feel it. Maybe it's the placebo of, I was just on a Rebel Wisdom thing this morning, and it wasn't recorded, so don't bother looking for it. But it was great fun. It was so much fun meeting those people and listening to them. But maybe it's the Rebel Wisdom placebo impacting on my system, them with all their distributed consciousness and sense making and triangles and integral and all of that stuff. How do I feel about it? I feel great. This is what my father said the night before he died. So much for that placebo. But what it is all about is the thought physicality duality, isn't it? Isn't that what this is about? And so Harvard is just, throwing all these words at this thing, and it's about thinking. It's about this duality. It's the thinking world, heaven, and the physical world, the real world. But what did we start out saying? The idea that your brain, why didn't this say mind? Who edits these things? Because really, you see, you wanted to say brain. You didn't want to say mind. You don't want to act like there's a mind involved in any of this at all. But that's really what you're talking about. Do thoughts cause physical events? Well, we're in Harry Potter land here. As long as you say it in Latin, it's a spell. Do thoughts cause physical events? Or are the thoughts themselves simply part of a long chain of physical events? Well, now we're knocking on C.S. Lewis's door in his book Miracles here. But there's a lot going on here because, it's the white coats. It's believing in science and medicine that makes it efficacious. No, I thought science was whether or not you believed in it. I thought the mind was taken out of the system. I thought it was a monarchical vision, whereas there's no telos or purpose or anything like that. The doctor is the physical cause or a mental cause. But apparently, according to this Harvard thing, you can do this at home. And nobody said don't try this at home. So there's a lot going on here. The doctor is the doctor a chemical cause? No, but when you see the doctor, it releases chemicals in your brain. Well, why would seeing a doctor release chemicals in my brain? Well, seeing a Sports Illustrated swimsuit model releases chemicals in my brain, and seeing the cop in the rearview mirror releases chemicals in my brain, and seeing Daniel go by my window releases chemicals in my brain. Well, the doctor certainly has chemistry, but that's not the kind of chemistry we're talking about. And miracles are like supernatural, and seeing the doctor, that's natural. Oh, really? Well, so when you tell me I'm going to give you this chemotherapy to cure your cancer, or I'm going to give you this ibuprofen to lower your pain, or you say, well, I'm just going to give you a sugar pill to lower your pain, but because I wear a white coat, or because we just read this Harvard thing, and this Harvard thing says I can do this at home all by myself just by gathering my family around me and maybe having a ritual about the water I got out of the tap. Oh, tap water, great bringer of healer to my body, sustain myself, release my pain. I'm a pastor. I know all about rituals. Not as much as some of you other, much more ritualistic. I'm a Protestant pastor, so I only have little rituals. Because the Protestants got us into this mess. Well, not really. We just kind of a manifestation of it. But the pill crossing into the mouth, like going to the priest and receiving the host, right? Why is it a miracle if the minister prays, but it isn't if the doctor shows up in his white coat? So, well, we're reserving that miracle word for something else. Oh, are we? For what? Because experientially, that's not what I've seen. Pastor, come and pray for me. I many Sundays, there's a young man who will come to church after the service. He doesn't want to hear me ramble on or anything like that, but he comes just because then we have, 5 or 10 minutes together, and we talk about the things in his life, and I'll pray for him. And sometimes if things are bad during the week, he'll call me and, Pastor, can we have a word of prayer? No problem. I don't even have to be with him. He's never once asked me, Pastor, what are you wearing? Is it a white coat? I like it when you wear a white coat. Never once has he said that. Just, Pastor, will you pray for me? I will. And almost all the time we pray for exactly the same thing. Well, you might say, well, it doesn't seem to be helping. Well, he thinks it helps, or he wouldn't be asking me for it all the time. So what exactly is a miracle? What are we talking about? Now, this word miracle is a lot sloshier than most of you think. So if you just do this little Google scrape, how it rips off dictionaries here. Miracle, noun, plural noun, miracles, a surprising and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore considered to be the work of a divine agent. Well, there's kind of a definition that we have. Well, similar, a highly improbable or extraordinary event, development, or accomplishment that brings very welcome consequences. The thing is, when you look in the Bible, well, what Greek words do they translate as miracles? Well, sometimes they're signs and wonders. See, right away when you say signs, well, wonders, well, that kind of gets at it. Wonder is sort of, that's the experience we have, and so it's the thing that exhibits the wonder. But a good wonder, not a bad wonder, like the cops in the rearview mirror after I've been speeding. That's a wonder. I've a physiological chemicals get released in my body, but not the kind of wonder we're talking about. But right away, the first definition is just steeped in, would we have that definition 500 years ago? I don't know, but we certainly have the category, we certainly have the thought, we certainly have the words. Latin, mirus, or to wonder, object of wonder. Well, it's sort of phenomenological. It's sort of a that's the thing, right? It's something that just surprises us, but something that breaks the laws of nature, as if you found these laws. Where have we found these laws? Well, we dug a big hole and we dug into rock and ta-da, the laws of nature, we have found them. No, but they're all over the place and they're reinforced. And so again, you look at C.S. Lewis goes into this and Miracles. Well, what are these laws? Well, these are the repetitions of the patterns that we have seen again and again. We can reliably, if I drop my cell phone stand with a very accurate timer, this thing will reliably hit the ground within a range, pretty reliably again and again. And the amount of time it would take to hit the ground in 1977, even though we didn't have cell phone stands then, and the time we have now will pretty much be the same. We're living in a massive, extremely reliable environment. Well, wonders are things of, well, something has happened. And, here even the definition seems rather mental, doesn't it? Because, well, we started out talking about these mental events that seem to, well, aren't all mental events chemical? Well, yeah. Well, why are some mental events more chemical than others? And why do some mental events change us? And okay, we're going down the hole here. Because we use this word. One of the things that came up right away, put miracle into Google, and the 1980 U.S. men's Olympic team victory over the Russians. I'm old enough to remember that. And it was a big deal. And I was I think it was a senior in high school that year. And everybody was just over the moon, happy about this because it was a miracle. Well, is this the kind of miracle we're talking about? Well, it was an unexpected event. It was a wonder. And the Russians, that was, towards the end of the Cold War. And the Russians, of course, the Russians and the Chinese were elevating their status by winning in the Olympics, and all the complaining that here's a whole bunch of college kids who are fresh out of college versus this Russian team, which is really professional. And there we didn't have professionals in the Olympics yet, like now we have it. And, isn't Hume's definition of miracle all about probability? Well, yeah. Well, Lewis will go into that in the book too. Lewis keeps noting that history doesn't work on probability. Everything's a one-off in history, as it were, sort of. Well, it's probability when we're looking at, counting coin flips and counting dice rolls. And so there's lots of probability around, but, what did those pollsters say about Trump in 2016? And then he won. And then Trump in 2020. Go ahead and argue. But history isn't like probability. History is just one long string of one-offs. If you're going down to Vegas or Reno or an Indian casino and they don't pay you on the probability, or they might set the odds on the probability, they pay you on the card or the dice roll. And that's what makes the whole probability game fun. So what is a miracle? Right away, and Harvard placebo study. It's all about the expectation based on the limited data set we possess. Odds are good that if they have this medical condition, they will die. But they're only odds. And, well, and John makes this point often, and I everything that I've read, John's being very honest. Generic religion works. Just like it doesn't matter who's in the lab coat works. And this is why Christians want to say, no, placebo isn't a miracle because only Jesus gets all the miracles. But the difficulty is that as Christians, on one hand, and I make this argument all the time, I'm not a skeptic about miracles at all. The world is full of strange things. And John says, well, what about the counting and the horse? And yeah, and even the dude didn't know he was signaling to the horse. And at least according to how we use the word know, the horse didn't know the dude was signaling to him. It's just this mindless connection between the horse and the dude. And we're like, woohoo, look at what's going on. If you don't know about the dude and the horse, you can go back to the videos and watch that, because he was talking about the horse and the dude, and I didn't know anything about it. And after he said it, it's like, oh yeah, that rings a bell. And I'm sure I can Google it and find it. But is the doctor's white coat religious? Well, it kind of depends on what you mean by religious. Well, are all religions the same? Well, we're going to have to get to that. We will assert that there are limits to it. And so some of the people who contacted me after this video, they're like, well, you're kind of opening the door to anything. Well, yeah, no, because no, I don't think just anything is. And I'm rather skeptical about a lot of things, actually. And if you come to me and say, Pastor, you prayed over me and I'm healed, I'll say, praise God. Why don't you go see the doctor too? I'm pretty skeptical about all these things. And, the Roman Catholic Church is skeptical. Someone claims a miracle, it's like they come in with scientists and statisticians and they're not dumb. But as Lewis makes the point, neither were the ancients dumb. Mary shows up pregnant and everybody's like, we know where babies come from. And then an angel shows up and it's like, well, maybe I'll back off that, at least according to the story. But so impacts of thinking upon physical changes in the body. Do I feel fat? Maybe if I feel fat, I'll start to get fat. Will I start to get fat because I feel fat and I feel defeated? So then I start eating more ice cream and carbs and all those things I'm not supposed to eat. And I don't do my skipping meals and fasting and exercising and eating the right things and et cetera, just because I feel fat. So maybe that's the connection. But what's really amazing is that nobody seems to know why we feel fat or don't get fat or all those things. There's a ton there. And so, Harvard likes to come at us with its white coats and say, well, we know. And then, you have one person who goes into Harvard Medical or a Harvard doctor, and the doctor says, well, chances are if we give you this medicine, it'll work. You say, wait a minute, I didn't ask for a placebo. Yeah, but we know that safe and effective means, the big thing about the Pfizer vaccine is 90% effective. Oh, what about the other 10%? How effective would a placebo be? Well, the placebo doesn't have side effects. Well, isn't the point the side effects? There's just a host of questions here that, well, we don't want to ask some of these questions because why? Because maybe the white coat will stop working, and not just with the placebo. So the impacts of thinking upon physical change in the body. Part of what drew me to Jordan Peterson was he starts, talking about sacrifice, and it's like, well, wait a minute. What really is that idea about sacrifice? And it's the discovery of the future. Well, wait a minute. Well, what is the future? But we immediately acknowledge we're not really sure of what those limits are, and we're not. That's honest. We're trying to discover those limits by selecting and removing variables. Well, that's right. So someone comes in and says, Pastor, you prayed for me and I'm healed. Okay, was it just that you weren't feeling better before and you're feeling better now? And then we've got this other thing. So if it's God, well, God healed me. Oh, okay. Well, Well, there's this idea, which just because we have this word which's been floating out called psychosomatic. Ooh, that sounds very sciencey. That sounds very knowledgeable. That sounds very learned. So psychosomatic. Now, if you learn a little bit of Greek, it's like, wait a minute, that's not so fancy. Psyche and soma. You just said mind, body. That's all you said. You just said it in a different language. Just like Harry Potter magic spells. Say it in Latin and whoo. Go to the Latin Mass, and I just feel better after a Latin Mass than one in Old English with that priest up there using all the same words I use. So we want to try to discover these limits. Well, that's good. We should try to discover these limits because there are limits. There's a reason we have the word miracle, and there's a reason we save it. And so, I'm kind of a troll, and I've been trolling Christians for many years, and sometimes I get my fill of there's miracles all over the place. It's like you're going to wear out that word, and so when the real thing comes along, you're not going to have a word for it. Then they'll say, it's really a miracle, or it's a very miraculous. Oh, okay. Why don't you save the word a little bit for something that's really miraculous, and so we can just have one word instead of two and save ourselves a little bit of breath. You sit around, and so Christians then have other things. And, one of the favorite things is, well, that's a God thing. And so then I'll say, what, do you mean like the sun rising this morning? Isn't the sun rising this morning a God thing? No, that's nature. And, now we're barking at the meaning crisis again. Because physis, nature, natura, Lewis talks about this in the book, is that which we sort of expect to happen, like the speed at which my cell phone stand falls. But the sun standing still, well, they wrote that down because, they obviously thought it was important. Well, did they just make it up like a story? Well, some will say yes and some will say no. Well, the sun doesn't stand still. Well, the sun wasn't moving to begin with, was it? Well, what if the earth stopped rotating? Well, that would be a problem. But then again, all of these one-offs are just one-offs. And, well, what if the sun refuses to shine like an eclipse? And you begin to read these things in history. It's like, well, it gets very strange, doesn't it? Well, we want to expand the data set via projection by reducing the data set. Isn't that exactly what we do? It's such an ironic thing. We expand the data set by projecting. Well, the sun never stops. Well, when you say never, you have just expanded the data set to infinity. Well, why did you do that? Because you're trying to employ the monarchical vision. And you say, the sun never sets. Well, wait a minute. The sun never stops. Well, wait a minute. Isn't the sun always stopped? Well, the sun, depends what frame of reference you're viewing the sun by. If you're in the solar system and the sun is here and the earth is moving, you say the sun stands still. Well, doesn't the sun always stand still? Well, not if you're looking at this big sweep, this imaginative sweep of the galaxy. The sun is on one of these little arms, and it all depends on kind of the pictures in your brain, doesn't it? So every time you say laws of nature or something like this, or you sort of invoke a scientific image, well, you expand the data set to infinity by reducing the data set to a tiny little natura. Tiny little process that apparently is purposeless, even though every time you put your foot on the gas because you want to go to the store because you're hungry or you're going to see the guy in the white coat. Well, which guy's in the white coat? I keep talking like this. Some of you are going to want to send me to a guy in a white coat. But that's where we're at with this stuff, isn't it? Well, if I put my foot on the gas, well, then I expect the car to go, and I expect the internal combustion engine and the electronic ignition and then the traction of the tires on the ground and the stoplights and the taxes that pay for the roads and the electricity in the place that I'm going and the not COVID or the mask that I'm wearing. I mean, we invoke this, but we reduce the data set to expand the data set. That's what we do all the time. So the reason we want to do this, to do what? Well, the reason we want to say, well, generic religion works is because we're a little bit nervous about the Jesus-y stuff, or the Buddhist-y stuff, or the Islamic stuff, or the Native American stuff, because the Native American, well, yeah, that Jesus stuff, that works sometimes, but we got the real stuff, because you're going to have a hierarchy, and it's like, well, Jesus only cures 30% of the time, but But this ritual here cures 50% of the time. Go with the ritual, right? Because you want to get cured, right? But what if you're a Jesus person and not a Native American spirituality person? And so maybe the Jesus person, well, studies have shown, well, who have they studied? Well, they've picked people randomly. Really? If you pick Americans randomly, guess what? They were all born after 1900. It doesn't really seem like a random sample of human beings. I'd say probably a whole lot of human beings were born before 1900, but they didn't show up in the study. Well, why not? Because we picked them randomly, but there's all sorts of variables that your randomness can't account for. And so here we are. So the reason we want to do this is to decide whether praying to Jesus' name is more efficacious, there's that word again, than praying in the name of the flying spaghetti monster, or Zeus, or Thor, or any other Roman god that was a healing god, and I can't think of their names right now. But the flying spaghetti monster, just like Jesus, is bound up in a world of mental and physical things. So if you pray to Jesus and you grew up in a Jesus place, well, bang, it's a miracle, or it's a placebo. Well, how do you know? Well, a placebo isn't a miracle because we give the doctor someone. Well, I'll tell you that as a pastor, I'm paid to give the people something. So, and if they get cured and healed or feel better when I pray for them, it's a miracle. And when the doctor gives them, oh, that's the placebo effect. Well, how often does the placebo effect work? Where our studies have said, we've expanded the data set, and it'll work 40% of the time. But it depends on, it'll work more for these things and not those things. In other words, you're just shaving any odds off your miracle, because if you give someone with cancer the placebo effect and the cancer goes away, well, what are you going to say? Well, I guess we're going to start doing placebos for cancer. No, you're going to say it's a miracle, or I don't know why, or I'm going to withhold judgment, or. So does Jesus or any other narrative asserted agentic matrix have a privileged claim? And that's what John asked me. And that's well, as a Christian, I'd say, yeah. Well, I'm deep in the Jesus-y people, aren't I? And others who have had rougher treatment by the Jesus-y people say, no, they're a bunch of frauds and shills and grifters. That's a fun word now, grifters. Jordan Peterson's a grifter. Paul Vanderklay's a grifter. James Lindsay's a grifter. They're all grifters. It's sort of a, Depression era word, which conjures up all. And it's the point of this. Everything's conjuring stuff up. And where are you going to get your data set for any of this? So religion in general works, and well, they do a study, and they notice that the Jesus-y people don't necessarily get healed much more than the people with the other religions. And of course, you'll do your statistics, and well, there's a lot more Jesus-y people probably in the people you're checking with. But have you been sampling the tribes in Papua New Guinea? No, they weren't part of the data set. They might be an interesting data set. Why? Because they're living in a very different world. No, they're not. They're not living in a different world. Oh, really? What world are they living in? What relevance realization factor determines the world? Now, in all of this, we're using reason, and really that's where we began, and that's sort of where J.P. Marceau and Jonathan have been having, John have been having their conversations, and Lewis starts with reason. Well, why? Because that's what we're using to try and figure out if, they always call them sugar pills, but I don't know that they put sugar in it, because we're now, 50 years ago, sugar was fine, and now sugar's the enemy. So flour, no, those are carbs. So these quinoa pills we're giving people, the first chapters are all about reason, and it's reason and causes. And of course, John, it's got to be so careful talking to him. He's read all these books. He knows all this philosophy and sciencey stuff, and I'm just a humble pastor. And so then he opens up whole ranges of things like, oh, crap, I'm in the middle of this conversation. It's going to go on YouTube, and I'm going to let the Christian side down. And in fact, Lewis talks about this. He says, with his Socratic society, that's what he named it, which was mostly from a women's college. Every time the Christian debates the non-Christian, what does the non-Christian have to lose? What does the Christian have to lose? Well, it depends on the context. Now the Christian has to lose Every time we go on YouTube and try to, put our little flag in the ground, we could lose the argument. And then, well, what are we using? What are we using to try to establish a common playing field with the non-Christian and the Christian, the Jesus-y people and the skeptical about Jesus-y people? And the Jesus people, well, they'll smuggle Jesus. Well, what are the non-Jesus people smuggling? Well, where reason seems to be, but there's reason and causes, and they go both ways. And gosh, John brought that to me. It's like, oh crap, I'm gonna have to learn about this now too. And there's so many interesting books I'd like to read. And they go both ways, but are they the same? And so one of the things I never got around to talking about in that conversation with, because no conversation, you can get around to everything that pops into my head, but what kind of a thing is a reason? Now, if I say it that way, it's different than what kind of a thing is reason, or what a reason is. Well, what is a reason? Well, here's a little definition that I cooked up in making these slides. Reason is a mental thread that can be pushed. Now think about that. I was kind of proud about that. Reason is a mental thread that can be pushed. Why? Because you can only pull a thread. And what we do is when we look at this world, we look at these threads. Now again, Lewis's chapters on how we speak are really important. A little later, I'm going to mention Paul Antleiter's because Paul listened to our conversation and he went off on hyperobjects and did a bunch of research, and so I could benefit from the research that he did and just listen to his podcast instead of redoing all that research. But I followed the thread. He followed the thread. Well, what do I mean? Well, a thread is kind of this long thing, and it's sort of like reason. It's one thing to another. But threads, when you say, well, doctor, why do I have lung cancer? Well, do you smoke? Well, yeah. How long have you smoked? 40 years. That's why you have lung cancer. Well, the odds are, the odds are. But I know him, I smoked with him in high school, and he's still smoking today, and he doesn't have lung cancer. And the doctor says, well, he probably will. What do you mean, probably? Isn't there a pill I can take? Yeah, that's the one that's marked placebo. Or we have this other pill that's basically going to kill you from the inside out. And maybe it'll work and you'll have the last few years of your life vomiting and losing your hair if you have any left or anything like that, and decide which pill you want. Well, it all depends what your goal is. So reason is a mental thread that can be pushed. Well, the reason for his lung cancer was his 40 years of smoking. And again, Lewis pulls this apart. I'm going to have to do a lot more thinking about this because John asks some really important questions. And the thing is, John asks hard questions and has good reasons. And so that's why these conversations are stimulating and important, and why I keep going back to them. Don't smoke or you'll get lung cancer. Oh, but now I've sort of pushed the thread, haven't I? Because I'm an agent. I am not going to smoke so that I don't get lung cancer. Now, I've never smoked. Could I get lung cancer? After my sister died, they're like, well, now you got to go get some procedures because your father and your sister dropped dead suddenly of heart attack. So you might be next, Paul. Then I go to the cardiologist, and she sits back and says, you have an impressive family history. That's not exactly the word I would have used, I told her. Because impressive sounds like a good thing, but of course it made an impression that, 5 members in my family of origin, 2 have dropped dead of heart attacks, and so then we have all these tests, and in one of the tests, well, there's this little thing we saw in your lung. But it's probably nothing. Most of the time it's nothing, but I still haven't talked to my primary care about that. But I grew up in Patterson, and Patterson had bad air. And then I lived in Santo Domingo for a couple of years. Santo Domingo had terrible air. All these emission stuff that we complain about, it kind of makes a difference in terms of what goes up into the atmosphere. And now I live in the Central Valley, and we have bad air. And so maybe I've never smoked in my life, and my parents didn't smoke, but maybe I'll have lung cancer. But I'm not smoking in order to not have lung cancer. It's that agentic, reasonable set of processes that we reduce the data set to explode the data set to come up with an idea, and then somehow I can, cigarette, Paul? No thanks. I'd like to not smoke. Oh, okay. This is our agentic approach to the world, and the reason I don't smoke is because, well, I don't want lung cancer. So reason is a mental thread that can be pushed. I like that. I'm sure some of you will debunk it, which is absolutely fine because you just make me better. You're only making me stronger, you know. What agents will be permitted in public? Because this is really where the thing goes. And so my video about belief in God is not the key difference between Christians and atheists, because we can all agree that, well, maybe he has cancer because he smoked for 40 years, and I'm not going to smoke so that I don't get cancer. But what agents are permitted in public? Well, I prayed on the person and their cancer went away. Or I prayed on the person and their cancer was diminished. I had an experience when I was an intern, and there was someone in the congregation that had just gotten the news that he had, all of this cancer in him, and I prayed for him, and I didn't even go over. I didn't lay hands. I didn't do a ritual. I didn't do any of this. I just prayed for him in just my prayer time, and I was at that point playing around with some more charismatic stuff, and so did some imagery and all of this, but I was the only one involved in the ritual. And of course, just go ahead and Google prayer studies, and yeah, there's a rabbit hole. Just, is prayer effective? Well, do they know you're praying for them? Well, what if it's double blind? What if you're praying for randomly selected? Well, they're not really random because they're sick, and on and on and on and on and on. See, random has its own monarchical vision aspect to it too. But what agents will we permit in public? Well, if it's a doctor with a white coat with a pill that says take this, well, that's an agent that we can kind of come to grips with. But the only publicly permissible agents are human beings, and that in many ways is post-enlightenment. Okay, that's. But again, what we're doing is we're reducing the data set in order to explode it. Well, why do we want to explode the data set? Because we want it to not only include all those people that we randomly selected for our studies, but everyone else who's ever going to live in the future, at least within my lifetime, within the scope of affairs and impacts that I want to determine. And so don't talk about God. Well, God number two, the super thingy that's up there within the meta-divine realm that we can call and please or offend or what have you. But this whole agent thing is just getting fuzzier and fuzzier. Now we have these hyper objects. Corporations are agents. Oh, you better believe they are. Your insurance company deny benefits to you. That's pretty agentic. The governments are agents. Government agents. We even have them. Racism is an agent. Yeah, racism is an agent, but what sort of thing is racism? How is it agentic or is it arenic? Well, it's sort of both. Markets are agents. Oh, they certainly are. And just check your retirement account if you're lucky enough to have one. The universe is an agent. Verizon Lisa asking the universe, should I get a new LG phone? Universe, because I don't want to say God because I would lose status if I started talking to God if I lived in California or New York, but I could talk to God if I live in Mississippi or Alabama or Texas or Florida. In California, he's universe. In Texas, he's God. Or history as an agent. Well, history has brought me. Why do we talk this way? Why do we live this way? All of these agents around, but only human beings. Hogwash. How do we account for this? So yeah, Paul did this podcast on cosmic spiritual powers, hyper objects, and C.S. Lewis space trilogy. And of course, Paul grew up charismatic, and so there's stuff all over the place. I talked about Frank Peretti with my conversation with Michael DeFucia and Michael L. What are we doing when we use this word hyper objects? Well, we're in a world of objects, right? And so now we suddenly have to account for markets and governments and Santa Claus and Uncle Sam and global warming and all of these things. And so we hack the system and now we have hyper objects. We could have called them super objects, or maybe they're not objects at all. Well, if they're not objects at all, then how do they fit into our world? Well, you're just jury rigging materialism all over the place, sort of like when Daniel Dennett says, well, there's matter plus information. It's like, well, go find me a real materialist, please. Stop posing as one. Once you have information, well, what is informing? What is forming? What is causing? And we're all back in Aristotle again. Now, according to Jordan Peterson, and I keep trying to synthesize and because just yesterday I had somebody in my church say, "What's happening with Jordan Peterson? I haven't heard anything about him for a while." And he doesn't listen to my videos or anything like that, but he's just a person in church. And what does Jordan Peterson think about God anyway? And so Rick and I kind of looked at each other and laughed because, well, I don't know, you got about 300 hours of videos you want to listen to? I do. God, I put it in quotation marks for those of you listening to the podcast and not looking at the slide. God, in quotation marks and scare quotes, is an agentic accounting variable for Jordan. Now, Jordan might believe in something much more than that, but he's saying in public, that's the modern liberal, this is the agreement. In public, I'm not going to trot out God number 2 in any way that sends Sam Harris towards the podcast microphone in too much fury, but God is an agentic accounting variable. Well, what does that? It's the hyperobject of all hyperobjects. If you want to make him into an object, but most Christian theologians say, nah, you really can't do that. Sits atop of your hierarchy or your hierarchy of hierarchies. And we feel comfortable with this formulation because it doesn't disturb our buffered self. And in a world of dead, we are left as the only agents. That's what we're comfortable in. Oh, you mean to tell me that this entire modernistic frame is, well, that's not the only reason, but it's sure part of the reason. Because we get scared by the thing at the other end of the line, or maybe we get excited by it, so we go down to San Diego, to the Del Coronado, and we Google which rooms we want to sleep in because there something might be on the other side. And I don't believe in ghosts, but I sure want to go on the Del Coronado room ride and have the lights go on and the doors open and close and hear about the woman that took her life in that room, etc., etc. We want the world to be re-enchanted, but but what is nature? What is physis? It's this predictability so that I know every time. Now, if I let my hands off here and it doesn't fall, well, then we got some spooky stuff going on. And part of me is really excited about that because now we're into unmapped territory. Part of me is terrified of that because we're out of the map. So in a world of dead, now we're knocking at the door of the meaning crisis again, we are left to be the only real agents. I am master of the cell phone stand. So we all have to fear. So all we have to fear are the rest of us plus power. What is systemic racism? Racism plus power. What is patriarchy? Maleness plus power. Plus power, plus power. Well, what is the power? The power are these hyper objects, or maybe the thing itself is a hyper object, or we don't know. So then we have emergence, and our rule says emergence is the biggest fudgy thing I see these guys pulling. That rule's been on my channel, and he comes to the Friday morning question and answer. Well, I can't think of I think it's Stephen Meyer had a conversation with someone else about these maybe it was with James Tour about these self-organizing systems because, a self-organizing system like a tornado. And so this emergence is real. So government agency emerges, school spirit emerges, racism emerges. Global climate change emerges, or maybe it doesn't. Donald Trump's presidency emerges, or at least a swelling of support. It all emerges. It's sort of self-organizing. Well, what does it have and doesn't it have? Well, it has systems, and the thing is, we can't really, the consciousness we possess, we sort of map onto each other. It's sort of like unless we're a really obnoxious solipsist, we afford each other consciousness, and we assume that their inside is like our inside, but we don't say that the tornado has reason. Well, it's natural. What do we mean? We mean that we even though we can't do it, we assert that it will go by some reason. Well, what do we mean by? Well, that's the thread. That if we could account for all of the atmospheric pressure and the terrain and forces, we're saying, Well, it isn't that the tornado in its self-organizing way has developed consciousness, and the anti-racist tornado intentionally destroyed the white trash trailer park. Said, I see the black folks there. I'm going to be an anti-racist tornado. Well, what are we looking at when we're thinking this way? We say, I don't know, Vander Clay, you shouldn't think this way. You're just going to get yourself in all kinds of trouble. Well, yeah. Well, what do we mean? Well, the tornado didn't hit the trailer park for a reason. Well, except all the reason that we build into the system, the atmospheric pressure and the statistics and all of that. No, what we're saying is that, good old Aunt Mildred, who's been a racist all these years, went straight into her house. Well, now we're sort of in Pat Robertson land, aren't we? And Katrina hit New Orleans because of all the gays in New Orleans, but it was all the poor black folks who probably go to church every week that really got zonked by that's because of racism. So before it was Pat Robertson, and the reason was because of all the gays in some district in New Orleans, but the abortions that people were having, but the real reason was racism. So the hurricane was racist. Clearly the hurricane was racist because all those poor black folks in New Orleans really got clocked. Well, no, we're not going to say that Katrina was racist. We're going to say that global climate change is racist. And just notice what we're doing with the agency here. And in many ways, the whole anti-racism thing is, I've walked this through in other videos. You have these different definitions of racism. You basically have motivational racism. You have motivational racism, which is one person being an agent or a tornado, sees a person of a specific color and either decides to mean them well or mean them harm. And so that's motivational racism. Then we have propositional racism that we say all white trash people live in trailer parks. So that's a proposition that we surmise based on valid or invalid or assumptions about people of certain races or classes, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's systemic, which basically says that, it's the outcome. It's sort of outcome racism. So you have motivational racism, propositional racism, and outcome racism. And you say, people who got swamped by Katrina were disproportionately people of color. Okay. And then what you do, sort of with a sleight of hand, is you say, see, climate change is just another manifestation of racism. Now, wait a minute. What have you done? You've just taken a motivational thing and just slid it right into the outcome thing. Oh, but you've done it at the risk of a propositional racism. Oh, but don't ask these questions. We're on a moral mission here. Let's fix the world of all the bad stuff. So we have this little mental drama imagining the tornado as consciousness and a reason. A reason, not reason, because we say, there's lots of reasons the tornado hit where it did or Katrina hit where it did. Anti-racism sees their whiteness and the history of racism and or go straight for their trailer. To target intention, so now we have intentionality and the white people's trailer homes. But now again, we're barking at the door. We're barking on the door. We're knocking on the door. We're barking at the door of the meaning crisis, because as these great videos that have way too few views, and I can't think, but these little, from John Vervaake's first thing. Well, we got into this meaning crisis because the universe was dead. Well, it was dead because we saw it through one eye and we took all the, Katrina isn't racist. Well, meaning the hurricane. There's probably a racist Katrina out there somewhere. So if you're a racist Katrina, leave your comment in the comment section and everyone else will castigate you for your racism. The hurricane isn't racist. Okay. Everything else is dead. It's just us that have intentionality, and so we learn to push the thread. We learn to find chemicals that if you put in my body, and I'm not a skeptic about science, and I had this tooth extracted, they gave me ibuprofen and Tylenol with codeine. And they said, you're going to feel it for a while and take the medicine. And yeah, sure enough, if I take that medicine, it's not so bad. And then I don't need this medicine anymore. Yeah, just wait a few hours and you'll go back to that bottle. That ibuprofen works, I think. But the universe is dead and I alone am alive. And so I get to perform the rituals and put the pills in my mouth. Well, is it a miracle if it's involved in a ritual? Well, if it's a minute ritual in my church, then it's a miracle. Because if you've ever been to a Benny Hinn. If you've ever been to a Benny Hinn crusade, there's lots of rituals about it. It's filled with ritual. Well, are you going to say that this is only efficacious to some degree? I think you might be surprised at some of the effication you find. Watch Leap of Faith, Steve Martin movie. It's a great movie. I love that movie. But these emergent things aren't alive, meaning that they're not conscious, inside like we human beings are. And of course you have annoying Rupert Sheldrake out there saying, is the sun conscious? Don't ask questions like that. If consciousness is simply an emergent process by a certain configuration of electronic connections, he looks at the sun and says, it's got way more than any of our brains. Don't say uncomfortable things like that, Rupert. Rupert, you and your morphic resonance and all those ideas and studies about whether dogs really know if their masters are coming home or if it's timing or asking inconvenient questions. But are we alive? And that's where the meaning crisis comes from. Because on one hand, we recognize that the universe is really strange. And all of this white-coated artifice of science and things to make the pills work, it's not always what it says it is. But at the same time, if everything out there is dead, what if we're dead too? What if we're the walking dead? What if we're the zombies? But are we alive? Or maybe we're all non-player characters. What if we discover that we are fundamentally Group A? Remember, Group A are things that are colonized, things that go on their own purely. Group B have, this is where Lewis comes in, have reason. Because for Lewis, reason, capital R, is this thing that emanates. Now we have our emergence and emanation. Reason emanates from God. Well, is it only given to Christians? No. It's given to everyone. Just like the sun and the rain, according to Matthew, according to the Sermon on the Mount. It's given by God. And reason is, and that's the thing, you get to Lewis, reason is, he doesn't want to say reason is supernatural, but he kind of implies it. He doesn't want to say reason is miraculous, but he kind of implies it, because reason is the way that we push the thread. We saw how the thread went, so now we can push it. And, well, you can kind of push a thread, can't you? But that tends to be our agency, isn't it? It's sort of like pushing a thread. Well, you can kind of crumple it up and do things with it. You can pull things pretty reliably with a rubber band, but it takes a little bit more finagling to push things with a rubber band. And so what if we discover we are fundamentally Group A objects, then some other human or Voltron, groups of humans coming together into a principality equipped with hyper object, is going to colonize us and expose us for being non-player characters? Well, there's our meaning crisis right there. And so this is, again, why Lewis starts with reason, because this is how I think Lewis mentally argued his way out of the meaning crisis, because he said, well, look at the cover of the book. There's this emanation from above, which is reason. And Lewis is saying, most of the time, we're really non-player character-ish. We're sort of like Katrina and the tornado. We don't name tornadoes so much because there's so many of them. Are they miraculous? Well, isn't miracle all about the odds? No, I thought miracle was about God or your religious tribe. Well, Lewis starts with reason because he's like, it's pretty amazing we reason anything at all, or that reason works, because he starts out with reason in nature, and he says, nature seems quite comfortable being colonized by reason. It's when we line up all the things and push the thread, or when we're really good, we pull the thread. It's his way out of the meaning crisis, because reason is available to us, and we do it. But it isn't something that is really controlled by us. And so just read the book. There's also an audiobook. But he also resists pantheism, which is sort of a cheat. And I caught this when I watched Avatar, and, it's a pantheistic movie, and I love C.S. Lewis's chapter on pantheism in there. And again, when I talk to people, I talk about religion. No religion. But if I make pantheistic noises, they say, tell me more. And Lewis says it's the oldest trick in the book. It's basically human religion. Well, what do you mean? Well, and again, read Lewis's chapter on language. There's, a life force. Use the force, Luke. There's a life force, but the minute Luke tries to use the force, well, of course modernists love pantheism. They only wish that they might be solipsists as well as pantheists, because then they could be God. We resist pantheism because it's sort of a cheat. And suddenly, when they're fighting the evil invaders and for unobtainium, is that what it was called over in that world with all the tall blue people, and they're flying these sort of dragon-like things, but they connect with the long braids in their hair, but then suddenly nature starts fighting for them, and it's like, hey, wait a minute. If it's pantheism, those other people that are getting the unobtainium, they're just as much a part of the system as you all. No, but you think because you're riding organic creatures with long hair and a pretty tree that somehow you have a privileged moral position over all the people with their metal machines who came from a different planet to colonize and take all your stuff that makes your little glowy tree go. It's all one big show, isn't it? So the reason that pantheism gets us so excited is because then we think we might be Luke Skywalker. That gets exciting. Why? We're ambitious. We have to come to terms with the terror of reality. Well, what is reality? Reality is that which opposes my will and dismisses my power. I'm going to gather the family together and take the water from the tap and do our little ritual, and maybe I will feel better. Maybe if my family isn't enough, I'll call the neighbors and have them wear their COVID masks, and I'll zoom in the members of my church, and all of us together will exalt the holy water from the tap. And as I perform the ritual and say the sacred words and I drink the water, then in fact they all might start feeling better too. Well, the miracle seems to be emulating out, just sort of like reason does. See, and if John had asked me, well, is reason miraculous? And I said, why do you ask me uncomfortable, hard questions like that in the middle of an interview where I'm supposed to uphold the Christian side? And J.P. Marceau's video went out. I'm left alone here. Yes, reason is miraculous. Well, what do you mean by miracle now? Well, lots of people who don't like Jesus use reason, but where's it coming from? And finally, come to terms for C.S. Lewis with God, and he surrenders. Well, what does that mean? Well, he starts doing what is unnatural, says Lewis. What do you mean unnatural? I start not going just where I would go if I paid no attention. Chocolate cake, swimsuit edition video, free car, money found on the curb. Just following all my little impulses. And Lewis starts being changed, and people look at that and say, he's not chasing free cake or girls or cars or money. Or for Lewis, it would be avoiding the world and just sitting in a quiet place and reading books all the time, because that's what Lewis loved to do. But here's where we sort of get to the nub of it, the best I can understand, and it's the relationship between pluralism and democracy. We are ardently democratic. And Lewis treats this in the book, of the monarchical versus the democratic. We'll accept pluralism if we're allowed to demand equality. That's the trade-off right there. We all implicitly demand that the center be accessible from anywhere and anyone, and that no one has a privileged position. Don't have all your miracles be Jesus-y and leave out all the other people throughout time who have claimed miracles. I only believe miracles that are in the Bible, and I don't believe any miracles that I find Julius Caesar talking about or Donald Trump. Once you're into the miracle world, you're just there. And part of the reason people try to slam the door and keep it out is they want to keep out that mess. But you can only keep out that mess, I would assert, by a degree of willful blindness. And it's a matter of faith that you say, everything that I can't account for is accountable via my rules, which is exactly what the Christian is saying. We accept pluralism if we're allowed to demand equality. We all implicitly demand that the center be accessible from anywhere, anyone, and that no one have a privileged position. This, of course, is when I mention I'm a Calvinist, suddenly divine election pops up and say, it's unfair, banish it. I can't believe a God would be arbitrary. You have no problem with an arbitrary nature. You were born tall or thin, fat or slow, dim or brilliant, with great genetics that mean you won't get cancer and you can smoke for 40 years and your lungs just keep going. Or you have a weak system and by virtue of, doing everything that you could to eat right, you still die at 50. Nature's like that. It's totally unfair. Where does this idea of democracy come from? Nothing in nature suggests that equality and pluralism can be paired together or that democracy is in any way true. It's all probably simply a product of Christian theology and practice. It all goes back to Jesus. We'll ask Tom Holland. He'll probably tell us. And this is where, I get to choose my religion. Well, where did that come from? Well, you don't get to choose your facts. We've been squabbling about that for the last 6 years. The doctor will get to say, you don't get to choose your medicine. I choose your medicine for you. Well, can't we vote on it? No. Christianity or a religion of your consumerist choice. And towards the end of the video, this is where I said, what if, in fact, the most central features of something are the most rare? Or maybe the most universal. I mean, the history and reality is very uneven like that. Well, how many Big Bangs were there? I love Jordan Peterson's line, which wasn't original to him. Give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest. Yeah. Well, we're going to try and explain that too. Oh, you're going to test it? Uniquely significant events are not always accessible to all. Well, the French Revolution. I don't believe in the French Revolution. I don't believe in the Protestant Reformation. I don't believe there was a door that Martin Luther hammered a piece of paper on or maybe used a sticky note that was very, very long because he had 95 theses. Unique historical events are not always accessible to all. Well, how do I believe in the French Revolution or the Protestant Reformation or any of these things? Does anybody have the paper that Luther nailed to the Wittenberg door? Does anybody have shards of the original door itself? Or did some janitor at one point say, this door's kind of a mess, let's replace it? They put up some cruddy steel door because the young hoodlums of Wittenberg were breaking into the church and, sipping the communion wine. Well, this is sort of God's answer to Job, because Job's like, hey, wait a minute, I'm getting the raw end of the deal here, and my friends are telling me I've sinned. I want God to come down and, account for himself. And God comes down and says, oh, you want to do accounting? Well, let me ask you some of my questions. Where were you when? Well, he wasn't there. Are you a personal friend of Socrates or Jesus or Siddhartha Gautama? Well, when you say they were dead before I got here, Christians say Jesus is alive, and, well, I'm a personal friend of Jesus. Well, how? Well, why? Well, if I pray in Jesus' name, and then we have, of course, the unauthorized exorcist, of which Jordan Peterson is perhaps a resonant. He's just kind of rhyming from the unauthorized exorcist. You have all these. Jesus sends out his disciples and say, go and heal in my name and use my name. Say the word Jesus. Is that a placebo? Jesus says, spirit, come out, and suddenly they're not. Well, I think all those things that were schizophrenic. Well, I got a bunch of schizophrenics I'd like to heal with Jesus' name. And then the Bethel people come along and say, well, have you tried? Hey, fair point. I haven't tied them down to a chair and put my hands on them, and kind of want to tie him down because I have no idea with some of these schizophrenics where that whole conversation is going to go. but I pray for them, and they're still schizophrenics, and I say Jesus' name, and they haven't happened, and kind of seems like a placebo. Well, let's try this. Quite frankly, a lot of the psych meds that I see doctors prescribing to a lot of people I know, they might as well be placebos, because try this for come back a month and tell me if you feel better. That's what I watch happen. So, and as I said to John, a hierarchy will likely develop. Well, I'll accept pluralism if you give me equality, because, and this is basically the argument in Lewis's book, that, well, what if there's one event that sort of makes sense of the whole story? That's relevance realization. Is it? Will it? Now, of course, these are assertions that Christians are making. They may be true, they may be untrue. And Lewis says that dozens of times in the book, because, no, we're human beings and we're making statements and we're making assertions. But is Christianity any more right or less right than Nazism? Most of us would say, well, more right, because we have a moral hierarchy around, and if we say Nazis are more right, well, then suddenly we're worried about being cast in with a whole bunch of other people. So Christianity is more right, and, well, everyone is created equal. All men are created equal. Who believes that? Well, that's a statement of faith. Well, equal with what? In what respect? Well, equal before the eyes of the law. Oh, well, then what is a person? What qualifies? How do we get there? So is a placebo a miracle? Well, we want to say no. Why? Well, Christians want to say no because, if it's happening in church, which it happens all the time, then we say, yeah, that's placebo isn't a miracle, but a prayer is. A prayer can be. Doctor says placebo isn't a miracle, but he's not even going to want to use that word at all. We want miracle to be reserved for something, and that's a good instinct. We want it to be special. We want it to be supernatural. What, like reason? Like being able to really think through something that's hard and find the pattern and see the pattern duplicated, and, well, where do these patterns come from? Or do we want our miracles to be tribal? Only what happens within the walls of Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church will we consider a miracle. Therefore, we're barking at the door again. We're knocking on the door of secessionism here. What do I mean by that? Because there's a whole group of, well, miracles have ceased. Oh, okay. See, I don't buy that either, because it's like, no, I don't think they've ceased. Well, you can't produce one. Maybe that's a better definition of a miracle. Doctor, why does the doctor give someone a placebo? Because he can't produce a cure. If the doctor had a better thing than a placebo, don't you think the doctor would give it? Well, maybe it's a study, and so we're trying to fake out a group of people to figure it out. And so, okay, that's fair. But that's the point, right? Isn't a miracle sort of kind of going with something that you hope will have an effect? This whole video is miraculous. Or maybe it'll be a dud because maybe it won't have the effect that I think it will have. Is a placebo a miracle? Well, we're just arguing about the definition of a miracle. And what we really want to say is, do really strange things happen? Well, yeah. Do strange, wonderful, good things happen? Like people who had cancer no longer have cancer, and people who are sick are no longer sick. And okay, well, what kinds of things are associated with them? Well, maybe they're white coats and sugar pills, or maybe they're balding Christian ministers in dying churches praying in their little offices because the homeless people are leaving them some peace today for a little while until it rains, and then it's all going to be a mess. What are we talking about? Maybe we're talking about all of our dreams coming true, and maybe we're talking about the renovation of heaven and earth, and maybe we're talking about the grand miracle, as Lewis says, where somehow God becomes a man and goes down to the bottom and pulls up creation with him and walks out of a tomb with the flesh of creation 2.0. Well, what does that mean? Well, can I get Jesus to do like a cheek swab so I can see if the DNA changed or And if you sort of follow this along, you can sort of see our contours, because what we really want is, would I like to have a placebo or a drug that really works, like an antibiotic? Well, yeah, but those antibiotics, they're getting us into other trouble. And suddenly we find ourselves just sort of in the middle, in the same mess we always find ourselves. Because the truth is, we're awash in them. Take a look at Craig Keener's 2 massive volumes. He starts with the question of the credibility of New Testament accounts. And this was written, I think, 2009 it was published. So it's sort of at the height of new atheism. And this book probably wouldn't be published again because, but just read the book. He just goes pages after pages of accounts of this kind of miracle and that kind of miracle documented on. And you just basically get to the point of Lewis right at the beginning saying, this isn't an argument about evidence. This is an argument about worldview. And we want to filter to decide which really happened, but which of them are good. So, I go and I visit someone and I pray over them and they die. Well, let me tell you, at this point, a good number of the people I have prayed over have died. Okay. It's a reverse miracle. No, if I didn't pray over them, they probably would have died. If I hadn't prayed over them, would they have died sooner or later? Sometimes when I pray for people, I pray for peace, and sometimes death is the way of peace. I'm always praying over people who are dying. That's a big part of my job. So is it a miracle? Is a placebo a miracle? We don't know what a miracle is. What we're really in the realm is can we secure for ourselves the life that we think we want, even when you don't have a real good idea over what we really want? Miracles don't do that much in terms of our belief system. Again, this is Lewis's opening point, and I see it all the time. And for those of you who believe in the Bible, you can read in the Bible. Jesus, at least according to the story, stills the storm, and the disciples are just flabbergasted because what kind of agency does this man possess where he can stand up in the middle of a storm and tell the storm to shut up like I would tell my dog to shut up, except the storm is way more obedient than my dog? But then when they come to arrest Jesus, they're going to rely on swords. Well, that's not reasonable. That's how we are. We see a miracle and then, in the moment, our consciousness is flooded and the chemicals are surging through our body, just like the lab coat or the police siren or the opportunity or the threat or anything. Just our body fills with chemicals. And then, the day after the chemical, we might tell the story. And then when we retell the story, the chemicals sort of flush again, but not as much, sort of like the second time working at crack. And on and on and on. And then here come the temple guards with Jesus. And, according to one gospel, I am he. Boom, they all fall back. You think, you don't really need the swords if you're walking around with a dude who can still a storm, because if he can still a storm, he can play a Zeus and call down a lightning strike, and hit that one. Because a lightning strike will take out the temple guard a lot better than a fisherman brandishing a sword will. But all of that gets forgotten in the moment. Then you might say, well, therefore the story is just a whole lot of hogwash, because if a man had that kind of power, why would he allow himself to get arrested? Or maybe that's part of the story. And so the point about what we believe in miracles really means very little, because sometimes everything's a miracle and sometimes we can't find a miracle to save our lives, because that's usually when we look for miracles. What we really want is to colonize others. And I really like the scene in that Superman movie because he thought, if some dude is flying through the sky, and the Avenger movies went there too, because the Iron Man movies, because if you got a dude flying through the sky, moving the world and sending back time and stopping nuclear missiles, well, what point is the United States government and its military? What we really want to do is colonize others. And so when Superman shows up and, Jesus in spandex and a red suit, and a red cape, people are the most complex, most resistant, most powerful thing we know. And so what we really want to do is be God. What do you mean by God? Well, this more than just simply a variable, something that acts, something that governs the Irenic autocracy. It's something to colonize by, agentic monocracy. monarchy. We want to deny anyone or anything that power because, well, now we're back into, why are you going to bring Superman before Congress? Can you trust him? Well, what does it mean to trust him? It means watching him. It means implying. It means mind reading. It means all the thing that religious people do about the world around them. Well, I just lost my job. Does that mean God hates me? Well, my mother just had cancer, but it's gone into remission. Does that mean my prayers were answered? Well, they feel better because I gave them a sugar pill instead of benzodiazepine. Does that mean it was all in his head? Is a placebo a miracle? Now, this is why we talk to each other, because we ask each other uncomfortable questions and they force answers out of us, and we have to try to figure it out. And you know what Paul Vanderklay says in a video doesn't mean that much, but along the way, we learn to trust each other. We learn from each other. And I think we learn about God. So, is a placebo a miracle? You tell me.